Thank you for letting me take your attention. And thank you for coming. This is the second lecture talk in this weekend of events that we have organized in honor of the 10th anniversary of, in honor of Edward Said on this 10th anniversary of his death, and the 20th anniversary of his great book, Cultural Imperialism, about which Joe Cleary spoke so eloquently yesterday. The events will continue after this talk. Nuruddin Farah, who is here, will be giving us a reading of his own work at 4 o'clock in this room, so I urge you to stay and bring your friends, call your friends. And tomorrow, in this room again at 9:30 in the morning, we will begin a day-long series of seminars and discussions about topics relating to Said and topics that have been developed by individual scholars and critics upon the basis of his work. So I very much hope you will come. I need to take a moment to thank those who've made this event possible, beginning with the Dean of Arts and Sciences, John Cooper, the Humanities Center, and as an individual himself, Jonathan Arrett, the English Department, the Global Studies Program, the University Honors College. Thanks there go to Dean Edward Stryker, to some other individual faculty members who have offered their research support to this effort. Ronald Judy, who's here, Lynn Emanuel from the English Department, who is not here at the moment, but I'm sure will be here soon. If I've forgotten anyone, I apologize for these names. It's my great pleasure today to introduce, not for the first time on this campus, Aamir Mufti from UCLA. It has always been a great pleasure to introduce Aamir and to share his work and to join in conversation with him. And I'm sure that today, for me at least, will be a great pleasure, and for the rest of you, an even greater pleasure, since I think I have some vague idea of what's in this particular paper. Aamir is currently, as I say, at UCLA. He did his PhD with Edward Said, famously at Columbia University. He also was doing doctoral work in anthropology before, both at Columbia and at the LSE, before deciding to turn his PhD work into comparative literature at Columbia. In recent years, he's been working very intensely on the topic of what he calls the secularization thesis, and in that context has produced for Bandung a truly monumental and original collection of essays on the problem of post-secularism, which has just been out for a few months and has had a lot of influence and earned a lot of controversy, which is a good thing. It will be followed shortly by a second, smaller collection of essays in the journal on the same topic. The TLS, in reviewing Mufti's first book, which was published by Princeton and called Enlightenment in the Colony, subtitled The Jewish Question and the Crisis of Post-Colonial Culture, the TLS said, in effect, that Mufti had essentially both completed the project of post-colonialism and revivified the possibilities of research and scholarship in the field. And just as yesterday, the speaker that we heard, Joe Cleary, had developed his work in relation to Ireland and Palestine, in Mufti's work, the question of division, the question of borders, the question of imaginative space is also very prominent. He's currently writing at least 2 books, and I'm pretty sure there's more than that in the works, one of which concerns exile and criticism, so you can see the relevance of Edward Said here. Another involves the reinvention of Islamic tradition. I also know from conversation with him that he has deep interest in and special experiential knowledge of various forms of poetry that have to do with both Urdu and, I think, to some extent, Arabic and Persian. He's been working a great deal recently around the problem of global literature, which has been institutionalized, about which we also heard something from Cleary yesterday. That is, it's one of the sources for thinking about globality in Said's Culture and Imperialism. I refer you to Mufti's recent essay in Critical Inquiry, Orientalism and the Institutions of World Literature. I think I will stop there and just say I hope that you will enjoy this paper as much as I do, and ask you to welcome Aamir Mufti back.
Thank you, Paul, for that, as usual, overly generous introduction. Thank you all for being here. Paul correctly notes that this is not my first time speaking at Pittsburgh. I doubt that there's another campus at which I have spoken as many times as I have at Pittsburgh. Actually, yeah, come to think of it, I'm certain of that. And I'm, of course, very, very grateful for that. And many colleagues here, both who are actually here and those who come here regularly as part of my group of friends, the Boundary 2 Collective, have really been so supportive and encouraging of some, in some ways, pretty eccentric lines of thinking that that I've been following now for some years. The talk today is an attempt to sort of, I've extracted some material from not my immediately sort of finishable, as it were, book, but the next one, which actually is an earlier, it was started earlier, and it's been sort of, as some of you know, this book called Edward Said in Jerusalem, which has been sort of undergoing for a while, and it sort of got put on the back burner so that I could work on the world literature stuff, which is now very close. I promise you. And to one special person in this audience, I say, I promise you, it's almost finished. My publisher, of course. Thank you for your patience, Lindsay. Anyway, this is a bunch of materials that I've taken from a couple of different parts of one chapter in Edward Said in Jerusalem. And it's made me, the writing of it made me realize that really it couldn't be written in some ways. And it's an attempt to think about, in very broad terms, about a kind of international configuration. And for some strange reason, I have this compunction that in order to produce an account of an international configuration, I have to know a lot of stuff. About different places and different kinds of formulations of the international. So it's just requiring a lot of a really active sort of reading and thinking across a range of conjunctures and locales. Anyway, that's sort of by way of background. And it's called, I suppose it's called The Late Style of Bandung Humanism. And I'm really trying out these ideas here for the first time, and that too is a feature of my life, that I get to try out ideas for the first time here very, very often, often at Paul's or Jonathan's invitation, so I'm very grateful for that. Okay. The lines of critical thought that came to be called postcolonial criticism are conventionally traced to the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism in 1978. Like all such chronological conventions, however, this dating obfuscates, it seems to me, as much as it clarifies. While it recognizes this work as a sort of discourse initiating text, and I think there are elements of truth to such an interpretation, it does not help us see adequately either the larger field of ideas globally that might be relevant to its emergence, nor the earlier configurations of thought out of which it may have developed or from which it may be departing. It is revealing of the work revealing of the work of this chronology that the most often discussed figures with respect to the question of influence on Said are Foucault and Gramsci. There are those who have viewed the book as an application of Foucauldian analysis to the field of Western representations of the East, sometimes pointing out the contradiction between this mode of analysis and the supposed lingering humanism in Said. James Clifford's famous early review, I think, sort of argues along those lines, as does Ijaz Ahmed's critique of Said. And others have emphasized Gramsci over Foucault, for instance, Timothy Brennan, thus perhaps attempting to save Said in some ways for a certain conception of the Marxist tradition. Certainly, Said cites both these sources, Foucault and Gramsci, in his introduction, and while, if pushed, I might fall closer to the Gramsci side of this argument, the range of possibilities that it offers, that the argument offers, are at best limited and at worst have serious historiographical and political consequences. It is my premise here, sorry, I'm trying to just it is my premise here that we do not have adequate genealogies of the form of interventionist thinking that came to be called postcolonial, which is too often understood as primarily a first world phenomenon, and of course there are an important case to be made for its involvement in first world humanities and first world affairs more broadly, rather than ways of thinking and a set of concerns inherited from an earlier moment in the history of the Third World. The location of the intervention in the disciplinary spaces of Anglo-American humanities and its consequences for those practices is of course a subject of great interest. But as institutional postcolonial studies, at least in literature departments in the Anglophone North Atlantic, appears to be approaching its end, it may be time to consider what a fuller genealogy of that earlier set of interventions might look like. This is not an intellectual history concern, properly speaking, and certainly not a search for sources and influence. I am speaking instead of the social energies of thought configurations, ways of thinking as instantiations of lines of social force. My main argument in this paper is that the thought configuration that is most often occluded from view by the preeminent chronotrope of Orientalism's, the book Orientalism's Emergence, is the intellectual culture of what we might call Bandung, that is, the globally dispersed 20th century culture of anti-imperialist thinking and creative elaboration at the cusp of decolonization as a global process. More specifically, I want to suggest that we think of certain tendencies in Said's thinking as late Bandung elements, that is, that we think of him as a thinker of this configuration who comes late in its development and offers an imminent critical approach, thank you, an imminent critical approach to its epistemological ground. What would it mean for postcolonial modes of thinking in our own times to attempt to reclaim that link to this globally extended configuration, and what consequences would that have for the practice of criticism? Seems to me an important and urgent question in trying to renew the possibility of postcolonial ways of thinking, which I feel, and I'm not really going into much detail here about that, but we can talk about it, which I feel really have been damaged massively by disciplinization and institutionalization, unavoidable processes, obviously. Such a reactivation can only be thought of as an act of affiliation at this point. This, it seems to me, is at the core of Said's approach to the problem, rather than the filiational discourse of national belonging, which can remain intact even in its internationalist mode. More locally and concretely, given our institutional setting in the US Academy, or the North Atlantic Academy more broadly, such an effort requires, although I'm sort of on the Pacific side, as you know, not so much Atlantic, given our institutional setting, such an effort requires that we welcome the demise of institutionalized postcolonial criticism, a largely dead form of authoritative citation of both theory and literature, the former consisting of perhaps half a dozen canonized figures, the latter maybe 2 to 3 dozen works in the European languages, mostly novels in English. So, Bandung then, as historical event, I'll talk a little bit about, and this is really a kind of crazy exercise that I'm engaged in, which is trying to provide a sort of historical concept of the Bandung project as a whole, one of the most globally dispersed cultural configurations, obviously, of modern times. So it's a sort of impossible exercise, but worth trying, I think, in some ways. Bandung is one of the most resonant names in the political history of Asia and Africa in the 20th century. It refers, first of all, to the Afro-Asian Summit of 1955, as I'm sure you know, that brought together in the Indonesian city of Bandung leaders from 29 recently liberated countries from the two continents, Asia and Africa, including such statesmen as Sukarno, of course, who was the host, Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Zhou Enlai, People's Republic of China. I think the Chinese role actually in Bandung, certainly I have not understood it very well as it needs to be understood. Chinese intellectuals played a far bigger role in it than we tend to associate with the Bandung process and culture, which tends to focus on Nasser and Nehru, and then after 61, Tito as well. Okay, it was an attempt at generating coordination and solidarity between the newly liberated societies of what has come to be called the Global South, and to reject the geopolitical options they were being offered with the intensification of the Cold War. The process inaugurated in Bandung eventually led to the creation of the non-aligned bloc of nations in 1961, and its prehistory includes the Congresses of the League Against Imperialism, the first major conference held in Brussels in 1927, where a lot of these figures met, where a young Nehru, for instance, very famously met a young Ho Chi Minh for the first time. League Against Imperialism, and of course the 5 Pan-African Congresses of the 1920s to 40s, in which African-American intellectuals like Wright and Du Bois obviously had played very important roles, founding roles. Bandung itself came roughly halfway in this historical trajectory, the short 20th century, if we may call it that stretches from the latter's Du Bois's identification in 1903 of the color line as the problem of the coming century, to the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which, it cannot be overstressed, it seems to me, was as decisive an event in the life of the post-colonial world as in that of Eastern European societies, since it removed from the geopolitical scene even the minimal blocking of US-led capital's complete hegemony over the countries of the Third World, attempted complete hegemony, that the Soviet Union, the minimal blocking that the Soviet Union had made possible. It is in the aftermath of this removal that neoliberalism has emerged, in the words of my colleague Perry Anderson, as the most successful world religion in history. I think it's a fantastic phrase. Its adherents, its believers, can be found literally on every continent, in every province or every country, in every city in the world. As a gathering of leaders from among the peoples, Fanon would describe just a few years later as Les Damnés de la Terre, the Bandung Conference was a remarkable event and was received by both its supporters and opponents as an unprecedented one. Richard Wright, who on reading of the impending event in a newspaper, he stages his own learning about the event in this very beautiful, incredible way at the beginning of the work. Richard Wright, who on reading the impending reading of the impending event in a newspaper had rushed to Indonesia from Paris, described its excitement in these terms, and I quote, "I began a rapid calculation of the populations of the nations listed, and when my total topped the billion mark, I stopped, pulled off my glasses, and tried to think. A stream of realizations claimed my mind. These people were ex-colonial subjects, people whom the white West called colored peoples. Almost all of the nations mentioned had been, in some form or another, under the domination of Western Europe. The despised, the insulted, the hurt and dispossessed, in short, the underdogs of the human race, were meeting. Here were class and racial and religious consciousness on a global scale. Only brown, black, and yellow men who had long been made agonizingly self-conscious under the rigors of colonial rule of their race and their religion could have felt the need of such a meeting. There was something extra-political, extra-social, almost extra-human about it. It smacked of tidal waves, of natural forces, unquote. And the delegate's host, Sukarno of Indonesia, noted that it was, quote, the first intercontinental conference of colored peoples in the history of mankind, a new departure in the history of the world, that leaders of Asian and African peoples can meet together in their own countries to discuss and deliberate upon matters of common concern. So not to meet in Brussels, as it were, but to meet in a city in Indonesia. The communique issued at the conference promised the coming of a new internationalism, committed to the end of colonial rule everywhere and to racial equality globally at a time when Algeria, Senegal, Tunisia, and Morocco, for instance, were still French colonies, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanganyika, and the Anglophone West Indies still British ones, and the Congo a Belgian one. The unprecedented nature of the gathering itself promised new forms of construing politics and culture and new forms of solidarity across the globe. Very explicitly so. I mean, the communiques, for instance, very explicitly dealing with these kinds of questions. Bandung has come over the years, as you know, to signify the larger project of anti-imperialist internationalism that characterizes much of the political and cultural history of the global South. And in the 20th century, all those repeated, and throughout the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, all those repeated attempts since the middle of the previous century, sorry, this is completely wrong. Sorry, okay, I'll just start again. Bandung has come over the years to signify the larger project of anti-imperialist internationalism that characterizes much of the political and cultural history of the global South. All those repeated attempts since the middle of the previous century to bypass the circuits of exchange, economic as well as cultural or symbolic, that established the advanced capitalist imperial zones as the center and mediator of all transactions in world space. A conventional understanding of the postcolonial intervention of recent years sees it as rejecting the concepts and structures of the Bandung intellectual and political framework. I think this is a fairly common understanding. By no means universal, I'm sure, but certainly not uncommon. Rejecting the concepts and structures of the Bandung intellectual and political framework, offering a critique of supposedly rigid polarities of colonizer and colonized, and of nationalist thinking in favor of multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism. While this may be true of some individual thinkers, and the work of Homi Bhabha is often cited in this connection, the overall reality, I think, is a more complex negotiation with the nationalist moment and its characteristic concepts and procedures and forms of international solidarity. In fact, the latter's negotiation, this is Homi Bhabha's work, in fact, the latter's negotiation with Bandung is also more complex than it claims to be, the work of Homi Bhabha. Perhaps not unlike V.S. Naipaul's relationship to it in a somewhat different terrain. That is to say, the emerging sort of ability now for us to think about Naipaul as a post-colonial writer, whereas as recently as the early 90s, he's sort of seen as a ventriloquist of some sort, right? An essentially British writer, expressing, especially in his travel writings, a certain metropolitan Western and more specifically British view of the decolonizing world. And I think Said contributes to this in some way in a number of his engagements with Naipaul's work. But in Culture and Imperialism, there's a complete reversal really, where he speaks of him as one of the leading writers of the post-colonial world. And third wave feminism as a form of politics of solidarity across the divides of the late capitalist world must be also understood in part, at least, as a critique of the masculinist structures of third world internationalism conceived at Bandung or performed at Bandung, its aesthetics of nationhood as gendered allegory, and its preoccupation with the psychic structure of wounded masculinities, an imminent critique, we might say, which envisions a simultaneously feminist and anti-colonial subject. Finally, we must also consider the ease with which the non-aligned movement, historically the heir, the geopolitical heir to the project conceived at Bandung, passed into irrelevance, the ease with which it passed into irrelevance with the end of the Cold War and the emergence, however briefly, of a unipolar world. The participants of the Bandung Conference itself had been, as Wright tellingly noted, I quote, princes and paupers, communists and Christians, leftists and rightists, Buddhists and Democrats. That's a nice antonym, Buddhists and Democrats. In short, just anybody and everybody who lived in Asia and Africa, unquote. The principle of the gathering and the subsequent movement, in other words, was national sovereignty and nationalism. The very same political logic that the European colonial system had extended from 17th century Europe to the world as a whole, rather than a new and more revolutionary political principle, capable of effecting a more decisive break with the colonial world. In Wretched of the Earth, Fanon had warned against precisely this resolution of the possibility and promise of decolonization. In more recent years, the discussion about Bandung as a complex has centered around the question of whether or not the politics of Bandung have been superseded by historical developments. David Scott, for instance, has suggested in his book Refashioning Futures, already about 12 years old, that, as he puts it, the cognitive political world of Bandung politics, whose most developed philosophical elaboration he locates in Fanon's last work, have been, as he puts it, significantly altered, with many of the epistemological assumptions that held it together and guaranteed the salience of its emancipatory hopes, assumptions about history, about culture, politics, resistance, freedom, subjectivity, have been steadily eroded by the labor of anti-metaphysical and anti-teleological strategies of criticism, unquote. This is an interesting passage, linking the demise of Bandung, of global third world anti-imperial nationalism, to epistemological developments in the metropolitan societies. Not to put too fine a point on it, the rise of post-structuralism. In the same chapter of the same book, however, Scott also locates the final end of Bandung, in practical terms, in the coming to an end of the welfare statist experiment in Jamaica under Michael Manley in the second round of Manley. In other words, in the failure of a national progressive politics under pressure from the emergent post-1989 neoliberal order, the New World Order, as it was then christened by official American culture. I regret that Tony's not here. I really wanted to kind of hear more about the Manley sort of moment and how he sees the significance and therefore Scott's argument here about the world historical significance of the end of social democracy at that point in Jamaica. To enter into this debate at length is beyond the scope of the present paper, but I do want to suggest that the attempt to renew post-colonial critical thinking in our moment must take the form of re-establishing and re-evaluating its link to this earlier historical configuration. So what I shall do instead in the time that remains to me now is first describe in broad overview what I am calling the cultural complex of Bandung, the forms of critical thinking and creative elaboration associated with the project, and second, to suggest in a very cursory fashion how we may understand the relationship of certain important aspects of Said's work to this historical configuration. It is important to note that the cultural complex of Bandung proved in many ways relatively autonomous of its strictly geopolitical dimension, which was often marked by diplomatic failures from very early on, notoriously, alliance and solidarity taking a back seat to perceived national interest, exemplified most dramatically in the collapse of Indo-Chinese relations and the outbreak of border skirmishes in 1962. 62, I believe, yeah. Dispute over the border between India and the People's Republic. Okay, so Bandung as cultural complex. The realm of the arts and aesthetic thinking have a unique relationship to both the historical possibility that Bandung promised and the historical failure from which its legacy cannot be separated. Namely, the failure, I'm saying nothing about intention here, the failure of the elites of the decolonizing world to produce new and alternative forms of politics that would not simply help to reproduce dominant social relations worldwide. From the outset, the project had a strong intellectual and aesthetic dimension. Quite apart from the fact that many of its leading participants were statesmen, intellectuals, and writers in their own right, Bandung unfolded from the beginning as a work of imagination, as an effort to think creatively about the national patrimony and the modern subject's relationship to it, and about new forms of solidarity and being in common between vastly distant and different societies in the process of being in the process of being reorganized as nation states. We may therefore speak of the Bandung cultural complex, an intellectual and aesthetic constellation committed to what Gita Kapoor has referred to as partisan modernity, produced both in individual countries and regions and in exchanges between them, which sought to generate ways of imagining the world after empire. Writers and artists' visits, conferences and exchanges, collaborative publications, national and transnational art exhibitions, these are some of the forms in which the culture of Bandung was practiced in international terms. It is also interesting in this regard that Nehru's advocacy at Bandung and through much of the late 1950s of what came to be called the Panchshil or Panchasila, 5 principles of mutual coexistence between the countries of Asia following the decline of European dominance, were meant to evoke the 5 principles of Buddhist belief and practice, an association of Asian life as a whole with Buddhism, whose genealogy passes through the history of aesthetics, specifically through Okakura Kakuzo's, later Okakura Tenshin, he changed his given name. Genealogy passes through Okakura Kakuzo's influential work of Asian aesthetic philosophy, Ideals of the East, published in 1903, and the polemic, The Awakening of Japan, 1904, both widely received in Indian artistic and intellectual circles even before their publication. He spent a year in India and brought these manuscripts with him, and they sort of circulated underground. The latter, even before their publication, the latter work, Awakening of Japan, having famously characterized the continent as a whole as Buddha land. So this very sort of, geopolitical sort of concept of and practice of Panchshil that sort of Nehru becomes so invested in has a clear aesthetic trajectory and genealogy. It really comes out of that whole Pan-Asian aesthetics moment in the first decade of the 20th century, which show all these exchanges between Bengali and Japanese intelligentsias. Tagore was centrally involved in that. The first significant feature of this cultural complex is therefore its preoccupation with the national space, which typically came to be understood, of course, paradoxically, as both a historically new possibility and a primordial heritage. In almost every society affected by the culture of Bandung, the decades of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s are characterized by the visibility of cultural practices described as political, revolutionary, or protest art. The grinding poverty and inequality of the societies of the emerging world, devastated social landscapes, often as a result of violent and protracted wars of liberation, the struggle to achieve imagined community within borders that had originated as lines of colonial administration, often devolving into civil war, and a growing sense of shared experience between societies widely separated by culture and geography. All these questions became the materials of artistic and literary practice and of thinking about art and culture and their relationship to the truth of their societies. It is a period of movements in art and literature and of flourishing leftist journals such as Marbre, Transition, Moyen-Orient, and Lotus, the latter based first in Cairo and then in Beirut, an explicitly transnational journal with reach across Asia and Africa. Second, Bandung aesthetics opened up this preoccupation with the national space and its questions to affiliation with other similarly situated historical experiences across the world. Bandung aesthetic internationalism has a complex genealogy in the 20th century. Among its precedents must be included a number of transnational aesthetic tendencies in the first half of the 20th century, of course Pan-Africanism and the Afro-Surrealist aesthetics of negritude, as elaborated by both African and diaspora figures, obviously Senghor and Césaire, most famously, in the 1940s and early 1950s. Pan-Asianism, first elaborated by Okakura, Rabindranath Tagore, and others in their circles. Popular front-inspired aesthetics of social realism and anti-fascism, elaborated in complex ways by the writers of the Indian Progressive Writers Association, for instance, founded in 1935 in London. One of whose leading practitioners, of course, Faiz Ahmad Faiz, is not unknown now to readers of Boundary 2. He published a few things now, including my own work on him. And even pan-Islamic aesthetics, for instance, in the development of early forms of what has been called calligraphic modernism by Iftikhar Dadi in several Islamic age societies. Calligraphic modernism, literally calligraphic art, completely sort of removed from the traditional practice of, and forms of calligraphy. Okay. Drawing on this multiple and complex legacy, Bandung forged a synthesis that was planetary in its reach, yet based on the notion of the authenticity of local elaborations, newly conceived of as national traditions. The possibility of a new humanism and this is the third feature of the complex I am attempting to describe here, was therefore an explicit element in Bandung aesthetic and intellectual sensibilities from the beginning. Even Wright had pointedly noted a family member's response to news of the coming conclave. Why, that's the human race. But this was to be a humanism to be forged from the margins of the world system, very self-consciously so, precisely those zones of the human world that had been denied the attributes of a full humanity. If Sartre saw Fanon as undertaking, famously, the striptease of our humanism, i.e. European humanism, Fanon himself, and Bandung thinking more generally, seemed far more concerned with what kinds of accounts of humanity could arise from the cultural experience of decolonizing societies. As Geeta Kapoor has noted, of the cinematic practice of Satyajit Roy in the 1950s, what the art of this moment sought was forms for the elaboration of one's own humanity, and I quote her, with a glimpse of its nearly inexhaustible resources, unquote. It's a brilliant essay on Ray's practice, Roy Ray. Apologies to the Bengalis in the audience, where are they? There they are. Obviously, Satyajit Ray in English, known with that pronunciation. An extraordinary essay by Geeta Kapoor, who by the way, really, I think it's really a crime how little she's sort of known in our kinds of spaces. It's a terrible situation, and she doesn't care about it, so she does nothing to change that reality. But I recommend the collection of essays, When Was Modernism? It is therefore a notable fact that the anti-humanism that became, let me read the previous sentence. As Kapoor has noted of the cinematic practice of Satyajit Roy in the 1950s, what the art of this moment sought were forms for the elaboration of one's own humanity with a glimpse of its nearly inexhaustible resources, unquote. It is therefore a notable fact that the anti-humanism that became canonical in the Anglophone humanities upon the assimilation of continental and above all French theory in the 1970s and 1980s, and two of the culprits of that transaction are of course present in this room, never quite had the same valence for many post-colonial thinkers, the anti-humanist element, in other words, of the whole critical culture that emerged out of the assimilation of deconstruction in particular, but also Foucault and other kinds of French critical thought. It never had quite the same valence for many post-colonial thinkers and writers. It is telling in this regard that Said's last book to be completed in his lifetime is the collection of lectures on humanism, where, commenting on the status of the question of humanism in the academy, he notes, I quote, "Although I was one of the first critics to engage with and discuss French theory in the American university," I don't think that's unfair, right? Although I was one of the first critics to engage with and discuss French theory in the American university, I somehow remained unaffected by that theory's ideological anti-humanism, and he doesn't go on to explain, unquote. Afro-Asian artists, writers, and thinkers in the mid-century period in question typically viewed their own creative efforts and those of their national cohorts as part of a planetary ensemble that reflected the diversity of human experience worldwide. This ethos is reflected in almost every event, project, or gathering that carries the Bandung cultural imprint. That there are echoes of philosophical historicism here should hardly be surprising, for Hegelian historicism, with its notion of the unique spirit or mind or genius of nations and peoples, is a strong element in the culture of anti-colonial nationalism, often received through anthropology or Orientalism in various ways. The book that I'm about to finish has a kind of long discussion of this cultural transaction, if we can call it that, this sort of movement of historicism and Orientalism, which I see as a kind of hyphenated, single hyphenated entity into anti-colonial nationalist cultures in the 20th century. I mean, you know, we can come up with any number of examples. The Indian Orientalist stuff is very clear. People have worked on it, myself included, but anthropology as well in terms of African nationalisms. For Senghor and others, I mean, the work of German anthropology and Frobenius, it's all very well established, obviously. Okay, Said's attraction to Auerbach's refashioning of 19th century philology, which is essentially historicist in the Hegelian sense, meaning the 19th century philology is essentially a historicist in the Hegelian sense, can also be understood in this context as a turn to what we might term an exilic philology, as opposed to an organicist or nationalist one. And this is how I'm not doing this here, but this is in this other work I'm really reading Auerbach's sort of realignment of philological practice from Herder to Vico in some ways, and Paul, of course, has many years ago worked on that as well. And what I'm sort of arguing that this is really a turn to the exilic in Auerbach, which becomes clear in the world literature essay, of course, but in the writings on Vico, that's the sort of change, transition in some ways that Vico makes possible for Auerbach. And that's what attracts Said in some ways. And this leads us to a fourth and final aspect of the Bandung cultural complex, namely the question of its historical temporality, a sense of time out of tune with Western chronologies. I'm aware, obviously, with all kinds of problems with such a statement. From the imputation of anachronism inherent to the ideology of developmentalism, characteristic of the post-colonial state and its elites, backwardness, underdevelopment, primitivism, to formal experiments with narrative time, third world culture displays deformed, destructured, or excessive temporalities. The compressed short century, as Oakley and Weiser has called it, of the arts of African liberation, the longue durée evoked by Indian modernism's treatment of religious mythology, and therefore mythological temporality, the whole progressive school in painting, for instance, in the 40s and 50s. The repeatedly thematized Long March in Chinese art had an encapsulation of revolutionary temporality, among many other such chronotopes, structures, figures, and images. Geeta Kapoor again has addressed this problem in the form of a succinct question. When was modernism in Indian art? She speaks of, I quote, our trajectories crisscrossing the Western mainstream and in their very disalignment from it, making up the ground that restructures the international, unquote. Far from providing a rubric for alternative or multiple modernities, recent formulae that seem to me to leave intact the structure of the Euro-American chronologies, whose normative authority they claim to be challenging, such trajectories highlight the antagonisms of modernity as a single but divided and conflicted social and cultural space. Paul, how much time do I have? We started sort of late, so we started 20 minutes past, I believe.
We don't need to leave here for 33 minutes.
Oh, that's pretty short. Okay.
It could make it 43 minutes.
No, we need to have conversation. Okay, I'll leave some things out and sort of try and move towards a kind of concluding section, not a conclusion per se, concluding section, a long conclusion, shall we say. That is to say, turn more directly to Said. And in some ways, this will really of necessity have to be very, in some ways, quite quick and cursory. And I'm happy really to have your comments and objections and all modes of intervention. So Said and the late style of Bandung Humanism. The book in which Said examines most at length the emergence of global resistance to imperialism in the 20th century is, of course, Culture and Imperialism. I obviously cannot engage with this work fully here, but it would be helpful to make at least two observations. First, one of the core concepts of this work is that of the voyage in, as he calls it, in the 20th century from the global south to the center. It is an elusive concept in many ways and seems to me to harness two rather different registers. That of the movement of peoples on the one hand, and another more abstract one of the slow convergence between north and south, center and periphery. The very emergence of a culture of resistance to the imperialism of the societies and cultures of the north is a sign for Said of this conversion. This culture was the work of, he says, I quote, intellectuals from the colonial or peripheral regions who wrote in an imperial language, who felt themselves organically related to the mass resistance to empire, and who set themselves the revisionist critical task of dealing frontally with the metropolitan culture, using the techniques, discourses, and weapons of scholarship and criticism once reserved exclusively for the Europeans, unquote. The very act of resistance enacts a convergence, making unstable the identity formations of colonial society. And the demographic movement of peoples from the global south into the societies of the north emerges out of or is an extension of that more abstract and perhaps historically earlier convergence. These things are quite deliberately, it seems to me, kept sort of ambiguous in this formulation, these two registers and how they relate to each other. The whole question of chronology or temporality is really very unstable, it seems to me, in these passages, which may be a good thing or a bad thing. We can talk about that. A second observation I would like to make about culture and imperialism concerns the way it ends. The sweeping historical account of the emergence of the culture of imperialism, of the entanglement of Western culture with imperial process, of the subsequent rise of a more or less organized culture of resistance worldwide, and finally of the emergence of the postcolonial world and its new forms of asymmetries and inequalities, ends with a set of reflections on exile. Even when the opposite may appear to be the case, Said writes, liberation struggles are based on the, quote, exilic, the marginal, subjective, migratory energies of modern life, unquote. Imperialism should be understood as a double process, which, quote, consolidated the mixture of cultures and identities on a global scale, unquote, on the one hand, but on the other hand, I quote, its worst and most paradoxical gift was to allow people to believe that they were only, mainly, exclusively white or black or Western or Oriental, unquote. Oppositional culture must therefore take truthful account of this aspect of its life, for Said, of its relation to place and origin. Furthermore, and I quote again, exile is predicated on the existence of, love for, and a real bond with one's native place. The universal truth of exile is not that one has lost that love or home, but that inherent in each is an unexpected, unwelcome loss. Regard experiences then, he says, as if they were about to disappear, unquote. If we understand that these concluding pages of Culture and Imperialism are not isolated in Said's oeuvre, and I think it should be fairly clear to anybody who's sort of read across his oeuvre that that's not the case, it becomes possible to see that what his work undertakes is a radical refashioning of the meanings of homeland. In such works as Beginnings, the text The World and the Critic, After the Last Sky, the essay Reflections on Exile, and the polemical exchange with Michael Walzer, it's a fantastic little debate. That's the kind of polemic would be nice to have in Bangladesh. It's in the journal that doesn't exist anymore, Grand Street, in the 80s. Has it been republished somewhere? I don't think so. But I believe it's all still up online. That they keep the whole archive of the journal online. Sorry, I've lost my place. And the polemical exchange with Michael Walzer on the meaning of the Exodus narrative, Said reflects repeatedly and explicitly on the possibility of criticism and the relationship to a matrix of ancestral meanings and places. I quote again from the Walzer exchange. The strength of the Canaanite position, he says, that is the exile position, is that being defeated and outside, you can perhaps more easily feel compassion, more easily call injustice injustice, more easily speak directly and plainly of all oppression, and with less difficulty try to understand rather than mystify or occlude history and equality, unquote. If secular criticism entails a dialectical disturbing of location and connectedness, and this is the sort of broader argument in this chapter of mine, and really I'm referring back to earlier sections, which some of you have heard me present in earlier lives. If secular criticism entails a dialectical disturbing of location and connectedness, of nothing less than our habitual modes of inhabiting the world, then Palestine provides for it the image of the appropriate forms of attachment to place and people, of ties to the missing homeland. And I've relied here quite a bit on Joe Cleary's first book on partition literature, on the Israeli-Palestinian and the Irish partitions, and their kind of appearance in cultural works. Far removed in its affective, I shouldn't go off the reservation so often. If secular criticism entails, it's a terrible phrase. If secular criticism entails a dialectical disturbing of location and connectedness, of nothing less than our habitual modes of inhabiting the world, then Palestine provides for it the image of the appropriate forms of attachment to place and people, of ties to the missing homeland. Far removed in its affective and conceptual investments from the cosmopolitanism that has become prominent in many recent discussions in the humanities, as I've argued in an earlier chapter at some length, secular criticism is in the end more an exercise in anguished and failed attachment than one of sanguine detachment. The homeland of criticism is, in other words, for Said, a missing homeland. After the Last Sky is sometimes taken to be just 5 minutes. After the Last Sky is sometimes taken to be a work in national advocacy, an attempt to produce representations of the Palestinians, the very common reading, to produce representations of Palestinian life for a public sphere in which any such representations are strictly forbidden, at least were at the point strictly forbidden through a whole series of taboos. This is only very partially the case, it seems to me. What the book reveals is an attempt to think the grounds of conceptuality, the social and historical ground of some of the core conceptual practices of his work. To be more exact, it is an attempt to revisit what in earlier work, published a few years earlier, Said had elaborated as the dialectic of filiation and affiliation. One of the more compelling but also elusive aspects of the essay of The Last Sky is its exploration of the elusive Palestinian notion of the inside, ad-dakhil in Arabic. Anybody familiar, even a little bit as I am, with Palestinian Arabic will know immediately what I'm referring to, where people define their own place in the world by the use of the words inside or outside. And it's an incredibly inventive discursive strategy. It's just really extraordinary. I've seen amazing things done with it. And the signification, of course, is inside or outside Palestine. And what that comes to mean is a very mobile thing that can be made to do all kinds of significant work. The elusive exploration of the elusive Palestinian notion of the inside. This, it seems to me, is the core of After the Last Sky, really. An entire chapter, which he calls Interiors, is devoted to it, but it is present as a preoccupation in the book as a whole. At one level, Ad-Dakhil registers the fluctuations and inversions in meaning that result from the steady expansion of the Israeli state's control over communities and places once part of Palestine. It refers, Said writes, first of all, to regions of the interior of Israel, to territories and peoples still called Palestinian despite the interdictions of the Israeli presence. I'm still quoting. Until 1967, therefore, it meant the Palestinians who lived within Israel. After 67, the phrase expanded to include the inhabitants of the occupied territories. Unquote. Before this expansion, 1967, to be min ad-dakhil, from inside, or more literally from the inside, with a capital I would say, was an abject condition, a life most directly under Israeli domination and cut off completely from the wider Palestinian and Arab world. After it, after 67, to be inside, already inside as it were, is a sort of privilege to be envied. The privilege, Said says, of obduracy. Beautiful phrase. After the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which destroyed organized Palestinian political life in that country and dispersed its remnants to a beach in North Africa, in Tunisia, the focus of Palestinian life, Said suggests, is turned from outside to inside. The most dramatic sign of this shift is, of course, the mass uprising, the Intifada, that broke out in 1987 in the territories 20 years after their occupation. But another more expansive and more elusive level of meaning, Said notes, ad-dakhil, inside, points to those zones of the private and interior that emerge wherever Palestinian lives are lived. Zones of mutual encounter, recognition, conflict, solidarity, and above all, he says, coded exchanges. For those in the diaspora, the challenge, we might say, is thus how to live on the outside as if on the inside, and within hearing of outsiders, many resentful and frequently outright hostile, both in the Arab world and beyond. It might even be possible to say that this paradox comprises one of the book's central preoccupations, the myriad ways in which beleaguered and globally dispersed populations produce and reproduce a sense of commonality, but also a relationship to a place that is, in the dominant languages of politics and power, as I have tried to argue, a non-place. The force of exile, and the Arabic word that Said uses in manfa, an estrangement, ghurba, is so powerful and all-encompassing in Palestinians' lives. Said suggests that whenever they encounter one another, they seem to recreate Palestine, or at least an inside, however tenuously and for the moment. At one level, of course, Said's call from the late 1990s for a one-state solution may be understood as an attempt to bring the insights of diaspora and dispersal, now an irreducible element in the history of both peoples claiming a homeland in historical Palestine, to the question of the establishment of a homeland and a state and one society of two exilic and diasporic peoples. That's what he seems to be calling for. It envisions a state not of national but exilic and homeless peoples, and attempts to transform the Palestinian attempt to wrest a state from the global system of nation states into a permanent rebuke to the system itself. An exilic state, in other words, not a nation state. While this is evidently a position formulated from and with the experience of those outside, but it also reveals a profoundly dialectical nature of the production of outside and inside. For one of the most elusive and bitter ironies of the contemporary Palestinian configuration is that those Palestinians most fully inside, that is, those constituting Israel's so-called Arab sector, violently redefined as the Arab sector, are also those who are most outside, distant and decentered from a collective Palestinian and Arab existence, having become an alien presence in their own disappeared homeland without having been physically displaced from it, but placed under the permanent constitutive threat of uprooting and dispersal. So this population, it seems to me now, is the quintessential minority in some ways in the world, because of this constitutive, permanent possibility of uprooting and dispersal. To call for an exilic perspective from outside is therefore also paradoxically to call for responsibility to the historical experience of these Palestinians who are supposedly inside. Only the fragmentary perspectives of Manfa and its attendant forms of ghurba can make possible now an attitude of attentiveness to the totality of Palestinian and Jewish-Israeli experience. Said foregrounds the fact that Palestine carries an utterly unstable set of reference. Is it a country, a place, a society, a cause, an idea, or a frame of mind? This instability is now an inherent part for Said of its historical reality. But the fact that it is unstable does not mean for Said that it is chaotic or without form. In the well-known essay on secular criticism, and I've written about this at much more length elsewhere, Said speaks of a three-part pattern, as you will recall, in modern consciousness, in which the perception of the failure or impossibility of natural or filiative regeneration or reproduction of an order is followed by a pressure, he says, for producing alternative affiliative human relationships with this compensatory affiliative order, his term, compensatory, then itself becoming the basis for a new hierarchy, a new legitimation. The challenge for the critic for Said, broadly conceived, the challenge for the critic broadly conceived is to avoid playing a merely affirmative role in this process, to avoid becoming, as he says, its midwife. What the secular critical consciousness seeks then is continually to make visible, what it seeks to continually make visible is this cooperation, as he calls it, between filiation and affiliation, and this transfer of authority, as he calls it, from the former to the latter. This is a form of critical engagement that insists upon the possibility of emancipation, even as it expresses profound skepticism about the transparency of any such claim. The relationship of filiation and affiliation in this account is fundamentally dialectical in nature, the two modes of authority and association displaying a mutually constitutive tension, producing effects and reverberations within each other, and transforming or assuming each other's modalities. In After the Last Sky, coming to the end, in After the Last Sky, Palestinian historical experience takes the form of a dialectic that turns filiational loss, inability to reproduce a way of life and its matrix of meanings in its place of origins, into forms of affiliation. One of the most brilliant insights in Genet's last major work, Le Captif Amoureux, is precisely a recognition of this feature of Palestinian life. In the Palestinian Revolution, as it was called, Genet notes, anyone from anywhere could be a Palestinian. By the revolution, of course, Genet means the rich and complex political culture at whose center was the figure of the Fidayeen, who are, in my view, one of the least understood vanguards of the 1960s and 70s. Said's dialectic of filiation and affiliation therefore seems to me to mark his attempt to produce a late Bandung epistemology. Finally, what does it mean to formulate the Bandung project, the late Bandung project, from within metropolitan societies, practices, and institutions? First of all, this voyage in, that is the social condition of such a practice, as he calls it, voyage in, has enriched the culture of criticism in the metropolitan countries of the North Atlantic. I don't think there's any doubt about that. This will certainly not be contested by anyone present in this room, it seems to me. Although in the wider public culture, it is very far indeed from being non-controversial or uncontested. But the very difference from the culture of criticism just 4 or 5 decades ago, and obviously many of you have personal experience of that earlier moment, that earlier period. The very difference from the culture of criticism just 4 or 5 decades ago is, of course, enormous. At the other end of the global fissures, I'm not suggesting that I'm a very young man, I just didn't live in this country and was not part of that culture in a very strong sense. I came into it really late, after kind of college preparation and from the outside. Okay, sorry, I've gone off again. This will certainly not be contested by anyone present in this room, but in the wider public sphere, it is very far indeed from being non-controversial or uncontested. But the very difference from the culture of criticism just 4 or 5 decades ago, of course, is enormous. At the other end of the global fissures of contemporary capitalism, very broadly conceived. At the other end of the global fissures of contemporary capitalism, the transformation has been even more decisive. As the ground for the formulation of projects of opposition to the imperial process that continues to ravage communities and societies on a world scale. As I've argued in a series of writings, both published and unpublished ones, there's a sentence, half a sentence somehow went missing here. I can finish it if you just give me a... Yes. At the other end of the global fissures of contemporary capitalism, the transformation has been even more decisive. As the ground of the Western humanities, very broadly conceived, has emerged as the now universal ground for the formulation of projects of opposition to the imperial process that continues to ravage communities and societies on a world scale. As I've argued in a series of writings, both published and some as yet unpublished, even such seemingly radical projects of anti-imperialism as political Islam, and whether it's anti-imperialist or not is another question, I'm bracketing that off here. But even such supposedly seemingly radical projects of anti-imperialism as political Islam, which in its more consistent forms promises nothing less than the reversal of the entire process of colonial displacement, is no less implicated in the Western discourse now than those secular social forces that it likes to take as its antagonists and enemies. But unless we understand the enormous loss and displacement that this universalization has entailed, and I think this speaks to our earlier conversation in the editorial meeting to some extent, unless we understand the enormous loss and displacement that this universalization has entailed, we cannot fully understand its possibility as an enabling condition. Secular criticism, which argues not with the religious claims about the nature of the universe and of our place in it, but rather with its view of society, with its social claims, is in this sense a practice of late Bandung critical thinking, part of the ongoing and globally dispersed attempt to think the human in and against the double process of imperialism described by Said. Its false consolidation of human groups, as he puts it, on the one hand, and its simultaneous disaggregation of them into reified particularities. I'll stop there.
We have time for questions.
Good, let's go get a drink.
We have time.
And not
for
our
questions.
pieces.
No time for drinks. Sorry. No questions.
I know it's a very compelling and convincing argument. Yeah. It was a joke. Yes.
You stated at one point that, for Said in particular, but I think more generally for what you're trying to call late Bandung thought, the anti-humanism of French theory was not something that was accepted, Said explicitly. But
at the very least, we can say that does not have the same emphasis. At the very least, yeah.
It's kind of a new humanism as opposed to an anti.
Absolutely, yeah.
The one
of
exception would be,
course,
of course,
explicit.
maybe.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
The one exception might be subaltern studies, right, which rather explicitly grounds itself in Foucault, social work, etc. But Said writes the preface to Subaltern Studies, if I'm recalling it, to the first collection, Selected Subaltern Studies,
yeah,
1998, something like that. Explicitly putting Subaltern Studies as a project within the tradition of, he creates a kind of genealogy. He says, well, there are all these great figures, phenomena, et cetera. Post-colonial intellectuals that have emerged, and Subaltern Studies locates itself within that. Can you comment on that a little bit? I mean,
well, the fact that
Subaltern Studies is pretty explicit in its depth about deconstruction and
so is Said.
right?
So is Said. So Said, I'm not arguing against that, okay? What I'm really saying, what I'm trying to understand is, what is it that Said means when he says, despite my great involvement with post-structuralism, he wouldn't say deconstruction, obviously, but Foucault certainly he would acknowledge, and to some extent he would have to acknowledge deconstruction as well, although he might not. Okay? Why is it?
Althusser, maybe, is the name that has it.
For Said?
For you.
Yeah, well, that's another story. Yeah, we can talk about that. We can talk about it. But the question is why Said himself is asking this question because he has no answer really. He doesn't give an answer, and he says, "Why is it that for me, who was so involved so early on in this cultural transaction that brought French theory into the mainstream of Anglo-American humanities, work and education, right? Why is it that I have never been sort of tied to that very central, it seemed to many of us, aspect of this entire change in thinking, right? And I'm thinking sort of, I'm thinking socially, institutionally, not just what somebody says on page X, Y, or Z in a certain book or article. The way in which theory came into a certain emergence in this country, in the Anglo-American countries more broadly, over a certain period. Again, this is many people here who have lived this history firsthand, and I haven't. So that's the question he's asking. It's not about whether or not I'm not by God, by no means. And to some extent, he would have to acknowledge deconstruction as well, although he might not. Okay? Why is it?
Althusser, maybe, is the name that has it.
For Said?
For you.
Yeah, well, that's another story. Yeah, we can talk about that. We can talk about it. But the question is why Said himself is asking this question because he has no answer really. He doesn't give an answer, and he says, "Why is it that for me, who was so involved so early on in this cultural transaction that brought French theory into the mainstream of Anglo-American humanities, work and education, right? Why is it that I have never been sort of tied to that very central, it seemed to many of us, aspect of this entire change in thinking, right? And I'm thinking sort of, I'm thinking socially, institutionally, not just what somebody says on page X, Y, or Z in a certain book or article. The way in which theory came into a certain emergence in this country, in the Anglo-American countries more broadly, over a certain period. Again, this is many people here who've lived this history firsthand, and I haven't. So that's the question he's asking. It's not about whether or not I'm not by God, by no means am I saying, it is not kind of statement that this is a good old third world thinker, has nothing to do with this postmodern bullshit, Okay, and there are responses to the new Fanon readings now that make that argument. That this is all bullshit. Fanon is not this, that, or the other.
No, what I'm trying to get at is something a little different.
Okay.
That in his genealogy of subaltern studies.
Okay, I'm coming
which
to that.
has an anti-humanist warrant. Right?
No, I disagree with that.
They say. At least they make that claim. You can say, okay, they're wrong. What they mean by humanism is exactly the same thing as what I mean by humanism. But they say we accept theoretical anti-humanism as a starting point. And Zaid includes them in his genealogy.
There are moments in some of the key texts of early texts of subaltern studies in which they reproduce this formulaic anti-humanism, and it was a formula for a while. It was really a formula for a while. I remember graduate seminars when somebody was made to cry by being called a humanist. I don't know, Joe, if you were in that seminar. I think you were. It was Gene Howard's Ben Jonson seminar, of all things. Okay?
But maybe something important was being negotiated in the question of anti-humanism.
But I disagree with your reading of subaltern studies, which I know is very explosive ground, given your engagement with them. So,
Tom, and then stuff.
It's a brilliant performance, with all respect for the virtuoso linkage of the problematic of Bandung Conference, all that released as a series of irresolvable paradoxes, and the shift to the late style of Edward Said as a means of producing a ligature, a suture, to the problems established by the reflections on the Bandung Conference. I'm wondering about the way in which the examination of the relationship, the paradoxical relationship between the affective dimension of loss and filiation and the displacement onto the larger, let's call them governmental logics of affiliation, doesn't retroactively, especially in the description of the shared exilic condition of Palestinians and Israelis, produce through the discussion of Said's late style a mode of governmentality that is, just to invoke a Foucauldian term, a way not of addressing or engaging the political paradoxes that were released by your reflections on Bandung and its relation to the problematics of institutionalized post-coloniality, but its replacement by what, I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but what I hear as an entirely different problematic that is then retroactively recalling Bandung, but without any of the political valences or specific material questions in the earlier reflections. So let me put it simply. Has the shift to Said engaged the problems, or has the shift to Said's late style produced an imaginary that enables you to retrieve that problematic in what feels a regime, in what feels an affective and an epistemic regime of truth through Said?
yeah, I'm not entirely sure of what you're asking.
What is what you call concluding set of reflections on Said? What bearing does that have materially on the initial reflections about Bandung?
I see what you mean. Well, actually, it's a fairly simple, straightforward question in some ways. Maybe
it's
I'm
both straightforward and affective.
but beautifully elaborated. Yeah. So this obsession in Said with what we might call nationalism, inadequately, okay, but I think more accurately, is obsession with what we might call primordiality, okay. Anything, that is to say, any set of claims, right, of a primordial inheritance, of a primordial filiative link, etc., right? I mean, a kind of machinery of national determination in some ways. I mean, what is the meaning of this obsession that he has from very early on? And I think the whole discussion of beginnings as opposed to origins is very, very much imbued with this concern as well. Okay, and what I'm trying to really suggest in this chapter, and I've left out some things that might have maybe clarified that a little bit for you. What I'm trying to sort of suggest is that in part this obsessive, repetitive turn in his work, a kind of imminent critique of primordiality, which in this concluding passage from Culture and Imperialism also repeats, he ends with Auerbach again and the passage from Hugh of St. Victor. Culture and Imperialism, of all books, right? It's about the third or the fourth time in his chronology that he turns to this passage in the published work. And I think that in part is a critique of the national epistemology, if we may call it that, of Bandung very broadly, okay? Precisely out of non-national Palestinian experience, if you want to socially ground in some ways a certain kind of conceptual energy, a certain kind of conceptual elaboration. So that to me is explicitly a kind of immanent critical relationship to the entire complex that he was raised with. He was raised in the 1950s and 60s, and of course moved early to the US for education and all of that. I realized a very interesting fact. It really shocked me when I realized it. Edward was actually older by 1 or 2 years in the few instances that I was able to confirm than the leading intellectuals of the Fidayeen generation. Think about that. We think of them as another era. While Zuaitar, Ghassan Kanafani, all these leading figures are actually a year or 2 years younger than Said. In other words, he is entirely of the Fidayeen generation. Entirely of the Fidayeen generation. This great vanguard of the 60s and 70s that really we've not even begun to try and understand of the global 60s and 70s. They were, of course, a global presence, very self-consciously and assertively so. Anyway, so this whole agonized relationship to the possibility of national determination, the national resolution of the crisis of subjectivity and of culture and society, right? This whole tense relationship with that, I see that as a critical articulation with the aggressive nationalism, even in its internationalist mode, of the Bandung complex. Which is why I compare it to, which is why I raised the question of Herder here, okay, and the historicist sort of legacy. It's very much that sense of a concept of already existing peoples, as it were.
And would then the resolution, in quotes, be the proliferation of an exilic imaginary? Is this what...
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, to say that doesn't necessarily say anything, but absolutely yes. Against national... No, I mean, when I say that, I'm not really saying very much. One has to then say a great deal more about what that might mean. But yes, in general, yes, absolutely. Yes, Ronald.
No, stop these first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I want to come back.
I'm sorry, just 1 second, because I am taking note, thanks to Aamir's reminding me of the time. So I'm going to say, as it stands now, Stathis and then Ronald, and then we will have to take a break. Is that okay?
I'll be brief, really. I don't have a question so much as I want to come back to the first, the exchange on humanism, if only to maybe bring an angle in that you might want to comment. I think that it isn't really I don't think that we can clarify the issue by simply recognizing whether non-European thinkers of a kind of Bandung imaginary engaged with in specific ways with classic, so by now recognizably anti-humanist texts of the Europeans, because that alone doesn't say very much at all. I mean, obviously, Orientalism would not have been written without Foucault, but to call Orientalism an anti-humanist book and then somehow say it changed afterwards is, I think, a blatant error. So when Senghor gives his lecture in 1966 in Beirut with the title "Negritude is a Humanism for the 20th Century," he creates, I think, which is very much quintessentially Bandung spirit. And interestingly enough, inevitably a reflection on Fanon's critique of negritude. I mean, the kind of dialectics there is very interesting. He creates a situation where a kind of particularist notion of, in some ways, negritude is conceptualized as a universal notion against what were the standards of the universal that the Western way of thinking, obviously I'm speaking in code language, had produced, which the anti-humanist turn within the European thinking from Althusser onward found necessary to dismantle. And also flagging, in a sense, that the anti-humanism of the European intellectuals of the left is, perhaps unwittingly, caught up in the very problematic, at least in both geographically and historically, that they're trying to undo, while the humanism that these other thinkers are doing is of another order and does not need to go through the anti-humanist negation. I mean, I think this is really the game here. So we are, if we're going to then explore this further, and then Said becomes a later phase or later thinker in this trajectory, we would be. Although I mean, Said obviously is I think it was very much trained in European tradition. We all know that by his own acknowledgement. Nonetheless, this is the exilic personality that takes over, and I think that kind of humanism that they're elaborating on is much. It derives its name from the political resistance against the dehumanization of colonialism.
Yeah.
That's why it has that name. It doesn't have that name because it somehow is trying to figure out its relationship with Enlightenment thinking. I mean, though by using that name, it also explodes that relationship.
Yeah.
So I think this is
Absolutely. That's very good point. Yeah, absolutely.
Have I
Ronald?
Have I time?
Yes.
A couple of points and then a pointed question. Your account of Bandung and its connection to Edward was quite clear to me. And what Stassi says about humanism is important, although Seymour is not an example of Bandung's new humanism, but rather a counter-example.
Well, he responds.
It's important that a year later, 1956, at the first conference of Black artists and writers,
Right.
when both Fanon and Wright seek to articulate the broader epistemic reach of Bandung, which is taking up the Pan-Africanist conception
yeah.
of a new notion of the
Yeah.
human, they cannot be heard,
That's right.
right? Because the nationalism is already in the ascendance, which is why Gayatri, after describes Bandung, is stillborn, right? Jump ahead to your remark about the exile, and this is where the challenging question is, yes? Of course, with regards to Edward being in the generation of Fidayeen, he was not Fiday. This is an important point.
Yeah.
And on the question of Adache, that humanism, that new humanism that Fanon is talking about, has a genealogy which escapes the attention of the academic discourse, yes? And emerges in the Intifada, which comes from Adache, which, as you well know, is a discursive genealogy that Edward himself acknowledged he wasn't engaged in, and oftentimes dismissed in a way that was almost bordering on invective.
Dismissed what, sorry?
The Arabic Marxist critique
Oh, I
of
see.
Orientalism, right? And that genealogy, which I would argue is where the new humanism we're talking about actually achieves a political total. I'm kind of between Don's question about the material political problems you nicely lay out in Bandung, and how they actually play out in the world as we know it, and whether or not Edward's solution of exile is a solution for the populations engaged in formulating new humanism. That is to say, this exilic conceptualization, which I understand is a solution of sort, but for whom? Right? Because as you well know, Arafat, who used Edward almost as a tool in many ways, did not consider him a Fidai, but considered him, our American, not just our agent to America,
Yeah.
but our American. Right? So it may be a neat solution, but how much is it a solution that engages the politics and also the epistemological and aesthetic project that I would claim is the true genealogy of Bandung that you're trying to elaborate, that articulates the new
Yeah.
humanism?
I mean, Edward's relationship to anything that we could call Marxist is, of course, very fraught and very problematic. And I think he makes some very big mistakes in some ways. Who was I talking to yesterday? Maybe to Joe Cleary about it. For instance, the readings of the essays on India, Marx's essays on India, the New York Tribune dispatches, which he dismisses very, very quickly and very easily in Orientalism, for instance, and I think in one or two other places. I think it's just hugely problematic. Those essays are in fact incredible, it seems to me, resources for precisely the kind of renewal of anti-imperial thinking that he wants to do. All kinds of really very, very rich elements and a real understanding of what it is that is taking place in India under British rule. He speaks of it as a heap of ruins, and that's not just a kind of idle image. He elaborates of society as a heap of ruins, that the millocracy, he says, not the aristocracy, but the millocracy, has turned society into a heap of ruins in the subcontinent, he says, and then kind of goes on to elaborate that and what kinds of new social classes are emerging and what might be possible, historically speaking, for these classes, the anglicized middle class, nationalist middle class in particular. So anyway, I have a kind of a complicated reading of that whole conjuncture, which I can save for another occasion, but Said's relationship to all kinds of Marxist genealogies is problematic, okay? And what I'm trying to do, and I'm quite willing to imagine that did not come out very clearly here, is that Said is not just that Said is giving us a genealogy here. I'm trying to place Said within a certain genealogy, okay? And what the Saidian project in this regard, or the Saidian posture, or the Saidian orientation towards Bandung, in some ways, is exactly that. It's the Saidian orientation towards Bandung. It is not Bandung as such. That's not at all what I was trying to suggest. Okay.
I gather that, if I may.
Yeah.
My question was not as precise as I wanted. I was not thinking so much about this too easy dismissal of Marxist Orientals,
Yeah.
as I am about the way in which his response to, let's say, Malik Aamir,
Yeah.
right, who writes a critique of this, the way in which Edwards' response was really quite harsh, and in being harsh, shut down a particular line of Bandungese thinking in part of the genealogy you're folding him into.
Yeah.
As Gilbert Ashkar has pointed out in his recent book, perhaps unwittingly, Edwards' orientation.
What, the Holocaust book?
Pardon?
The Holocaust book? Or-
No, it just came out. It's on cosmopolitanism and Marxism and colonialism.
Oh, okay.
Perhaps unwittingly, that response to the young leftists who are part of the common genealogy or elaborating worked in concert with the Islamicist emergence, as well as with the very nationalism Edward wants to critique, to result in the foreclosing, and in the case of Ahmed, death of those intellectuals, and did play a role in shutting down that leftist tradition, one which Edward kept responding to in a way that only contributed to their demise. I'm saying add that to the genealogical position.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think I would go that far. My formulation might be a bit different, but yes, I absolutely agree with you. That has to be part of it. Yeah.
How did
Sorry? Contributed to its demise. I wouldn't use that formulation.
Going too far.
unwittingly
I'm not even unwittingly contributing to its demise. I couldn't formulate it like that.